I guess it's 1 o'clock. I think we can get started. My name is Peng Yu. I'm a lecturer of Chinese, working in the Chinese program. So I'm primarily teaching lower division classes, 100 level, 200 level classes. So my talk today is moving from drills to real conversation in the foreign language class. So I got this idea because last year I attended the oral proficiency interview tester training, and I got a lot of good ideas from that training, and I want to share that with all of you here. And thank you for coming to my presentation today. I know everybody's very busy, so I will keep very fast, very quick, and then we can have some discussion and some hands-on, okay? So I like to start with goals. That's all I always do with my students. So start with learning goals. So today my session aims to help you understand the ACTFL OPI, oral proficiency interview, how it assess learners' real language proficiency. And the second goal is to distinguish 3 types of questions or 3 types of practices that we usually do in classes. Maybe you already do it and unconsciously, and I just want to point this out so that we can have more effective and efficient drills in class. Okay? And the third goal is to formulate communicative questions, meaning that encourage students to do real-life communication with their language skills. Okay? So, I think we all know ACTFL, right? The American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, and they are famous for their world language standards for learners, the 5 C's: communication, cultures, connections, comparisons, and communities. It's their biggest thing. But my focus today is not on their standards. It's on their assessment tool. It's called oral proficiency interview. So it's a one-on-one interview, lasts about 15 to 30 minutes, depending on the participant's language proficiency. It may be longer, maybe shorter, okay? And it assesses proficiency, oral proficiency, okay? So let's talk about proficiency versus knowledge. So when we talk about language proficiency, it's the ability that the user or the learner, the language learner, use a language spontaneously, not rehearsed, spontaneously for real language, real world, daily life purposes. So it's very different from language knowledge, because when we talk about learning language, we talk about like learning vocabulary, learning conjugations, learning tenses, grammars, sentence patterns, etc., etc. So those are knowledge. Okay? This proficiency interview is not testing knowledge. It's not testing grammar. It's not testing how much vocabulary that the learner knows. It's test proficiency, how a learner can communicate in real life situation. Okay? How a learner can carry on a conversation. Okay? So ACTFL defines proficiency levels. They divided the proficiency level into 5 levels: novice, intermediate, advanced, superior, and distinguished. For novice level, intermediate, and advanced level, they have sub-levels. So 3 sub-levels for each level. Okay, novice low, novice mid, novice high. Intermediate low, intermediate high, intermediate mid, intermediate high, and advanced low, advanced mid, and advanced high. Okay, for our language courses, for our language programs, especially for lower division, we probably are doing novice levels and intermediate levels, 100 and 200 classes. Okay, so I'll be focusing on those. I know the letters are very small and probably cannot read. I'll show you this one. So let's talk about how this oral proficiency interview evaluates learners, how they use these benchmarks to determine which level they are at. Okay. I think the most important part I've learned from OPI is this chart, this rubric. Okay. So the OPI actually look at a learner or a participant's language materials, language samples. They look at the text type and accuracy, comprehensibility, and they look at content and context, and they look at functions or global tasks. Okay, how a learner or how a speaker can fulfill these criteria. Okay, because we are me especially teaching lower level divisions, so I'm going to focus on two proficiency levels: the intermediate level and advanced level. So let me explain why I want to focus on those two. Because when we train our novice learners, we are not training them to be novice. We are training them to be intermediate. So we are pushing them to another level, right? When we are training our 200 level students, intermediate level students, we are pushing them to advanced level. So I always ask myself to keep it in mind that I'm training my student to next level. So I need to be very familiar with the criteria of next level. Okay? So let's look at these two levels in details. Okay? Let's look at each criteria. So the first one is very easy, is text type, meaning that what kind of language that our students or our learner can speak, the length, the complexity. So the intermediate level determine that intermediate level speakers can use discrete sentences or strings of sentences. I mean, that makes sense, right? When a novice learner go to intermediate level, they can do individual or separate sentences to answer simple questions. Okay. For advanced learners or advanced speakers, they usually produce oral paragraphs. See, when we do a real-world conversation, and for advanced learner, they have to give like many more details. Okay. To provide more details, it requires like a lengthy conversation, right? So paragraphs and connected discourse, meaning that they can use transitions to make their point more smoothly, to give evidence, to give proofs, to give supports. Okay, so that's the text type. So for us as an instructor in the classroom, if we want our students to produce those languages, we need to elicit their answer, elicit their conversation. And we need to think about what kind of question we want to ask about our students, because if you ask an intermediate learner yes or no question, of course they're not going to give you discrete sentences or string of sentences. They can just answer yes or no. That's novice, right? If you ask an advanced learner, say weather, they probably just give you one sentence. So this weather is blah blah, and it's not going to be a paragraph, right? So when we conduct practices in class, we need to design our questions, or we need to design our prompts so that we can elicit our paragraphs, so that we can elicit sentences. Okay? The next criteria OPI looks at is accuracy or comprehensibility. So in modern language pedagogy, we are moving less and less far away from grammar centered. We do not talk about grammar anymore in classes, but I do love grammar. I still do grammars. And the OPI do look at accuracy and comprehensibility. That makes sense. If people cannot communicate like native speakers do, how they can communicate with native speaker, right? So that makes sense. So for intermediate level speakers, they can be understood by speakers who are used to deal with non-native speakers. So who would be the ideal candidates falling in this category? Us. We are instructors, we know our students, we know what they've learned, we know their vocabulary, we know their structures. So whenever they make mistakes, probably we can understand them, right? And the criteria for an advanced speaker is that when they speak, a native speaker can understand them without any difficulty. So quite different, right? So my point is, when we look at this criteria, the auto proficiency interview does consider accuracy. However, it didn't really specify what specific grammar, what specific vocabulary, what specific sentence structure we need to check on. As long as a native speaker can understand them without difficulty, it's advanced. If we can understand them as instructors, as teachers, without any problem, probably they're still intermediate, okay? So our next criteria is context and content. To me, it's like two different criteria. I don't know why they put them together. I think maybe they want to keep it simple and keep it concise. So for context, is talking about the settings, whether or not it is formal or informal, okay? For intermediate speaker, they can deal with some informal settings and limited number of transactional situations or semi-formal situations. And we look at the content, intermediate speakers, when they produce a language, it's usually predictable. That makes sense. We know what they're trying to talk. We taught them like certain topics. We know what they can do, right? They can talk about familiar topics related to their personal life, related to their daily life, their intermediate environment, okay? For advanced speakers, they can deal with most informal settings, okay? Not formal, most informal settings, and some formal settings. That's advanced learning, okay? We usually think about advanced learners can deal with most things, no matter it's formal or informal, but OPI or ACTFL actually defines that they deal with most informal and some formal, okay? For the content, it's topics of like personal interests and general interests, okay? So when we look at this, I'm looking at like mostly they're talking about for intermediate and advanced learners, they're dealing with mostly informal settings, okay? And talk about daily activities and personal interests, okay? To me, an intermediate learner may still have some difficulty with dealing with all kinds of situations. They're still learning things, and they may talk about certain activities, they may talk about certain interests, but not all. But for advanced learners, they can confidently deal with those situations, no problem, okay? So that's a major difference there. And the major part of that rubric is the function and global tasks part, okay? So for intermediate speakers, they can create with language, meaning that they are not using rehearsed language. They're using what they've learned and mix them and create and being able to ask and answer questions, handle very simple situations. Okay? For advanced learners or advanced speakers, they can narrate, they can describe in all major time frames. Okay? And they can deal with complicated situations. Of course, it's unrehearsed. Okay? And I want to point out that here, the advanced learners, they can confidently deal with all major time frames. Okay? That's part of the accuracy. Okay? And for intermediate learners, it didn't really talk about accuracy in this criteria. It didn't really say all time frame. Okay? So, after we examine all those criteria, what does OPI really tell us? And as an instructor, what we can do to train our students to be able to produce those languages. Okay? So firstly, OPI really closely look at the functions, meaning that how a speaker can deal with tasks, real-life tasks and situations and conversations. Okay? So intermediate, again, create with language ask and answer questions and very simple string of sentences. That's it. Okay. Advanced learners, they can narrate, they can describe. When I say describe, that also includes comparison. They can compare things. If they can describe two things in details, of course they can compare them. And they can handle complicated, unrehearsed situations. Okay? And OPI does look at accuracy. They do look at accuracy, whether or not people can understand it without any problem. But the benchmark is whether or not a native speaker can understand them easily. Okay? So intermediate, they can be understood by us very easily, but not necessarily native speakers. Advanced speakers, they can be understood by native speakers, no problem at all. And they can deal with all major time frames. Okay, that's advanced level. Okay. So, after we are familiar with all the criteria that OPI is looking at, our next step is how we can conduct our practices or drills in class to train our students to be able to fulfill those criteria, to be able to carry on a real-life conversation. Okay? Because when we look at drills, usually it's very mechanical. Say this, say that, and repeat, change drills. That's all we do. I do that all the time, for sure. But how we can push our students to next step, next level? When they step out to the real world, of course it's not going to be scripts. There's not going to be rehearsed. It has to be real life, real conversation, right? So if we can distinguish those three types of questions or practices that we conduct in class and more consciously using real life situation, maybe we can train our students better. So let's look at these three types of questions that we usually ask in class. Drill questions, meaningful questions, and communicative questions. Okay? For drill questions, I'm not going to give you a standard definition. I'm going to show you a sample. Okay? Usually on the textbook or on your PowerPoint slides, you have this dialogue. Let's read it. Let's repeat it. Let's pretend we know how to say that, right? So the typical procedure is you read after the teacher, or the teacher is the center, read after me and repeat, and you pair up and you switch roles and you repeat. Okay? It's very commonly seen in lower level division classes, beginning level, 100 level, 200 level, okay? Even some 300 level classes, okay? So next type is meaningful. Again, I'm going to give you a sample. So this could be a dialogue in class. After you explain a certain grammar structure, or you give certain like a group of vocabulary, and you ask the students to practice, we can conduct this practice like this. So, what is this? Okay, this is a computer. Right. So the answer is quite obvious. There's no processing there. You just need to use the structure and put the vocabulary there. That's okay. But it's different from drill. It's not simply repeating because it tells a little bit of meaning, although the answer is obvious. Okay, so it's meaningful. And I do that all the time. Yeah? And also this kind of drill or questions is seen in our beginning level classes. Okay? Communicative. Sounds really fancy, really good, right? Because it's communication, you're doing real world conversation, right? So this kind of question is like this. You're eliciting some information there, which you don't know, or they don't know, okay? For example, like this dialogue. What's your favorite color? You learn this structure, and they know how to answer that, and they just need to fill in their own information. So this kind of question seems like real conversation, real communication, because it involves negotiation of meaning. You are getting something from them, and they are getting something from you, and you don't know each other's information. That's negotiation of meaning. That's pretty real life, right? Okay, so these three types of questions. I'm not saying one is bad, one is good. I'm saying all three types are necessary. I do think they are necessary because when you introduce vocabulary, when you introduce grammar points, they need some mechanical drills to be able to fluently and confidently and comfortably using them to develop the initial fluency, right? Same thing for the meaningful questions. So they are good for consolidating vocabulary and structure and develop muscle memory. Because muscle memory gives you that fluency that you want, spontaneous and intermediate response. You don't want to ask a question and your student may thinking, right? So those two types of questions are necessary practice. But think about our ultimate goal is to train them to be able to communicate with real life, with a daily life, with real native speakers. So this is our ultimate goal. So how about we minimize those drills, those mechanical drills, because it's not real life, it's rehearsed, it's a script, okay? Move that and maximize the communication part so that when they step out of the classroom and they're ready. Okay? All right, so let's have some hands-on. Okay, I give you some cards. Maybe you can do this activity as a group and brainstorm some questions here. I'm sure you already teach those topics. It's very basic topics, and let's try to consciously think about what kind of questions we can ask there. You can write on the card and have some discussion.
Okay, hold on.
And I've got like a green card and this is getting done. I guess so. Oh, that's what that
What is this? The drill questions would be. Thanks.
So meaningful is more easy, like what color is the or what color is this?
Yeah.
I think that's communicative. What's your favorite?
Right.
Right, this is, oh, that's not a very good example. What about green? And what color is something that's in the room?
Right.
Meaningful.
So then what would a question be that's a drill?
Or you could say,
So just repeating it.
grass is green.
What color is that?
Is yellow, is brown.
What's your favorite?
Some kind of like,
Oh, okay, so like confirmation questions. How about?
Those are sets.
No.
Great idea. Those are, I don't know if that's blue or
Now that's, yeah, do you, what's your favorite color? Questions, like for the drill questions.
Exactly.
So is this red?
Initiate.
These are really good questions.
Also for meaningful.
Give me real questions.
Which one do you want, the chocolate or the
That's my
orange?
very sections, you say what color is this?
Yes, you did.
Yeah.
Nice, I'm gonna get
Like
these.
communicative, we could say something like, what's your favorite color? Or what color is a banana?
But,
Right.
so
There's no
if we
banana.
ask
What do we
like
got?
a
Suddenly,
question or
boom,
yes,
oh,
no
wow.
question, is
So
it
drills like
just
memorizing,
like
memorizing.
Because
meaningful
I'd still
or
be in the
just
meaningful category, because there's a specific definition to
Well,
that.
think about this, this doesn't get the questions part.
I think another question is things like communicative, like what,
Yeah.
let's see, like what are your
Yeah.
friends'
So memorizing
favorite
just
colors?
So show
It's not
pictures.
getting questions about
what
colors.
color is this?
What kind
What
of,
Fabulous.
what color clothes do you like?
Yeah, like the sun is yellow, the sky is blue, what color is
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I hear very good conversation here. So let's look
Okay, all
at
this
this.
is up for debate too, because I just want.
For a, I probably
Everyone's
should not put drill questions there because drills is script.
Yeah.
Is what you wrote on the PowerPoints or what are from the textbook, right? So let's talk about meaningful questions. What could be a meaningful question when we do this color topic?
Like, we look them up, you know, for example, what color is this card, you know? There's only one right answer.
Exactly, it's
Right.
very obvious
It's obvious.
and usually does not really involve thinking process.
Yeah.
They can respond
Like what color is
immediately.
the
Yeah,
sky when the sun is out or something?
Right, right, what color is a basketball?
right, right. What color is your wearing?
Right, right.
Right.
So does it have to be there?
It has to be obvious.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
It has to be very
It's not an
obvious.
opinion, it's a, yeah, right.
Because even if people don't answer that question, you know what their answer is going to be. It's predictable. Right?
It's like the difference, it seems like the difference between meaningful and communicative is the difference between knowing the vocabulary versus being able to use it in a
Exactly.
spontaneous manner.
Mhm.
That's the way I see it.
Exactly. All right, so how about communicative questions? So I already gave you an example, what's your favorite color, right?
What's the color of your house? What's the color of your house?
Exactly. Because in the classroom, if there's no picture showing on the slides and people don't know, they don't know the information, they have to rely on the speaker to give the answer to get it.
It's interesting. Oh, yes.
You know, like questions like what color do you like? Such a question to me is very communicative, but very low level communicative.
Exactly.
Because like I think many classmates don't care what color like other classmates like, you know.
I totally agree, yeah. So for communicative questions, it's not necessarily advanced level. It could be novice level, it could be intermediate level,
And I
depending
mean-
on the,
Low level as not proficiency, but low level of
Communication, yes.
Communication.
but still, because you are eliciting information, you are exchanging meaning, you're exchanging information, it's still communicative.
Yeah, without any physical props or,
Right.
yeah, any visual prompts.
Mhm.
Props and prompts.
Okay. All right, so this is for novice. very easy, and we can always do that. How about let's look at this topic. It's intermediate level, and the topic is finding an apartment. Again, we can think about these two categories. Okay? All right. So give you a few minutes.
Question.
So,
Maybe that's like, you can ask like, how much is the apartment? But like, if you've got the app in your hand.
Would be like
Yeah.
then you have the ad, but it's from that same. Which apartment do you like?
That's a way of thinking about it. Yeah, whatever else.
Description of the apartment.
Well, you could do it like, say you had some props of like a newspaper article, and you could say, how much is this apartment? You know, if you had something up there, like from the kind of like reality material, you could say, right, which is the most, which is the cheapest, or, right, yeah, which is, okay, so I see, yeah, which is the cheapest would be the meaningful that you're comparing, right?
Using specific structures.
Which is biggest, or which is cheapest, which is the closest to the school or the station, yeah, in Japan, the station. If you have material, but if not, like, what, for communicative, what do you want for your apartment? What do you need? Describe what you need, or something like,
They don't have to think of it
how
themselves.
many rooms, right? Right, how many rooms, do they take pets? Right. You know, can you, how many rooms? Information about the apartment, what do you need, like what is makitsuyo?
They don't want necessarily something
Like, how many letters do you want?
What rooms, does it have a bathtub, you know, that kind of thing? Or do you, yeah, I mean, the meaningful ones would be looking at some kind
Also,
of
how about the differences between
apartment material. I don't know, do they have those in Japan? Do, right? A little map and Joe and all that kind of stuff. And then the
Now we
community.
can move from like more questions.
What would
Which
you,
one has
what
more?
are your
You're gonna do it in practice.
But does that mean, does it mean that?
the meaningful
It could be
is,
everything
depends on the information they
That's
have.
just like a certain class, but
So the real information
right, so it's obvious information, right? Isn't that even, for intermediate, it's obvious? So the meaningful
like you
is
can get a
obvious.
little complicated.
Okay.
You can't do that
I'm ready.
sometimes.
Okay, so let's look at each.
Why? Yeah.
So for Jill, it's obvious, you just like type something on the slides or take a text from the textbook and ask students to drill, to mechanically practice those. So how about meaningful questions we can ask?
Okay, so one thing was like, maybe like have a list or a catalog of types of apartments
Mm-hmm.
and ask them to list different types of features that each apartment has.
That could be one, yes.
Or compare and contrast, like which is the closest to school, or, you know, if you have a map, or, you know, in terms of, or which has the most rooms, or
Google
which is the
Maps and-
cheapest, and which is, the, you know,
Right, right.
convenient.
So you have the information on the slides or in the front or on the catalog, and students can easily read and get those information. And when you ask those questions, you know what they are going to answer, right? So communicative questions?
The requirements that, for your ideal apartment.
That's great. That's a great idea. How many bedrooms do you want? Do you want furnitures in the room?
Furnished or unfurnished?
Unfurnished?
Pets
or
allowed or not?
pets fee? Utilities?
Yeah.
Things like that, right?
Utilities seem good.
Yeah. So I think you already got that. So those different type of questions. So I hope after this activity we are more consciously plan for our drills and to move quickly from drill from meaningful to communicative so that they are able to deal with real life. Okay. So I think I already did this. You're able to know how OPI assess learners with different proficiency levels. And we are able to distinguish 3 types of questions. And we are able to formulate communicative questions. Okay? So a lot of times, it's us making all those questions and ask the students to start the conversation so that they can carry the conversation on, right? So another level or the challenging part for a student is to formulate their own questions. That's always a hard part. Yeah, I can ask questions and they can answer, but how about you ask the answer? Okay. Let's go back to this finding apartment topic. So we can ask questions, how about when they go to real life, they want to rent an apartment, say in Tokyo. They want to find out those information. They need to be able to ask, formulate those real life questions. So to do that, I have another trick to share. Okay. So it's called quiz trick. How do you know that? It's very easy to do. So usually I give students, like each student 1 slip. Okay, I have those prompts here. I can show you, although it's in Chinese, but you get it. Okay. So I have, this is 202 class, 200 level, 300 level, and 100 level. Okay, so probably I give you.
Those guys can read it.
So this is how I do it. Each student gets 1 slip, and on the slip there's a question or a few questions, follow-up questions. Usually for higher levels, I usually ask why to follow up. And students pair up, and they answer each other's question, and then they trade their slip. And they pair up with another classmate and repeat the steps. Okay? So this is a very simple way, very straightforward way to do it, because you give them question. Although they're reading a question, it's script, but they at least they have a taste how you can formulate a question and how you can use those questions to elicit information from others. Okay? And of course, there are many other ways you can do it. If you are confident that your students can formulate questions, you can ask them to come up with their own question, and then do the quiz trick. Okay? And also, you can ask them to not only ask the question on the slip, but maybe ask a few follow-up questions if they are intermediate or advanced learners. Okay? All right. So that's it. I do read those slips. I want to recycle them.
Yeah, of course.
Very simple.
Yes.
Will your slides be uploaded to the Dropbox?
Yes. I will.